Okay, let me quickly run through how I did that. So you're using the same sort of settings that we would use in any animation sequence. I put a sky object in here. I've got global illumination turned on. I've simply put a floor in here and turned it the renderability off, so you don't see it in the editor, you don't see it in the renderer. But if I turn that on in the editor, you see that I do have this floor in here. And that was simply to use it as a collider object for my text. The MoText I've made editable, so it's now converted down to single extrude. Those rigid body tags animated to become enabled at about frame 115 or so. So before that point they're off, and then they are on, basically. So the keyframe is just making them enabled at that frame. So you can see here it's enabled. If I go back, the enabled button is checked off. And so that simply enables the dynamic action of the text objects. Background object is still the same. My texture is my video. And animation, I've got it set to exact frame. We saw earlier that that's allowing it to match up really well with the video that we'd placed in there. So that is how my scene is set up. The sky object, I went in and found an HDRI image from the content browser that somewhat resembled the color I'm using in my scene, so all of the yellow and brown and black that's going on in here. I thought that this image would do a nice job creating that sort of lighting environment, so I used that. I also turned illumination on for my texture. So you'll see that my background object has color and luminance, and I copied that channel into luminance, so it's actually backlighting with the image itself, as well as the sky object, to give some of the lighting appearance of the image that I'm using. So it's really important when you're trying to match move an object that you try to make it as believable as possible, that it's actually sitting in that scene. I've created a little plane, and the only purpose for that plane really is to create reflections for me. You can see that my video has reflections coming off of all the objects and the surface of the granite countertops. It's just a gray material, and it has a reflection. I'm actually going to crank the reflection up pretty high because we can change this in After Effects. And that's something I didn't do in the render, but I'll show you in a few minutes. But I noticed that it's something we need to do because mine was entirely too light. So that's how the scene's set up. If we just rendered one frame, you'll see it's going to look like this. So we've got the espresso coming in, and you've got the reflections coming in. I see something I should have done here, and that is cancel, close. That is turn my anti-aliasing on to best. You'll notice that my reflections were not looking very good. Okay. One other, I double click on that tag and look at the tag tab. You can see that I've just unchecked Seen by Camera, and I've unchecked Seen by Reflections and Refractions. And what that's doing is, if I check this again, and it's going to actually affect the reflections if I have these checked. So if I were to render right now, my plane is going to reflect that sky, and I don't want that. I don't want that seen in my reflections. All I'm interested in is the reflections of the text itself, so that I can use that in Cinema 4 or in After Effects to make it feel like it's really existing in that space. Okay, so I don't want it to see reflections. Turning it off by Seen by Camera will allow me to see my background object, and will keep the camera from showing up in the background. So all I'm getting is reflections. All I'm getting now is the reflection of the object itself, but I'm getting the lighting because it's seen by rays and GI from that HDR object. I have the same exact tag on my background, except I do have reflections and refractions turned on right now, and you could see that in my text a little bit. Because my plane is parallel to that background, it's not going to be reflecting anything. I could just as easily turn that off. and it's really not going to change the way my image looks very much. So you might want to do that. Okay. So that's the way the scene is set up. Let's also look at our render settings. So in render settings, you can see I've got save turned on, multi-pass rendering turned on. I've got global illumination and ambient occlusion turned on. So this is going to be a fairly time-consuming render, but to get that more realistic look, that's what I wanted to do. The important thing here is that we save out a multi-pass render. To set that up, you simply check multi-pass, and then in your save panel, I've given both of these the same exact name, but when it saves out, what it's actually going to do is add a little tag at the end of these for each one of these. So for ambient occlusion pass, it's going to say espresso AO. For the reflection pass, it'll say espresso REFL, something like that. So you don't really have to worry about things writing over each other, because anything that's multi-pass is going to have an extra tag added onto the end of the file name. So I'm saving these out as JPEGs. I've got the quality turned up as high as I can make it. Both of these are checked as JPEGs. To add things to the multi-pass, you simply click here and select the thing that you want to add. So there are a few things we have to add. Reflections, definitely. I want a separate pass for reflections, and the reason for that is when we get into After Effects, I want an image that I can use that only has reflections, so that I can change that setting so that it looks believable with the other reflections in the scene. Ambient occlusion, it's going to render out very dark, and I want to be able to lighten that up and change it a little bit, change color if I need to. Shadows we actually don't need because I don't have any lights in here aside from the sky plane, so there are no real shadows being cast. Global illumination, you could save out and use. You probably should. In the scene that I'll show you in a minute, I didn't actually wind up using it, but in other scenes it may wind up coming in very useful for you. Object buffer, really important. And what that's referencing is, you'll see this compositing tag on my Mo text. And it has everything checked here that was standard, but I went into the Object Buffer tab and enabled this so that Object Buffer number 2 is enabled, only on the Mo text. And so for my Object Buffer setting, when I added it in here, I changed the group ID number to 2 so that it coincides with that text. So these two things have to match. And what that's going to do is render out a completely separate pass just for your text object, so that you can use that as a mask. So let's take a look at what it looks like when we do render. I'll just go ahead and I'm going to pull up the previous render that I did in the picture viewer, and what you'll see now is, let's put this on image. This is actually the image that I'm rendering, and I'll go ahead and make this smaller so you can see it fit to screen. So this is what the render looked like. It started off back here, and we're zooming in until the text falls over and begins to roll. But you can see I've got nice reflections down here. I've got a lot of the nice ambient occlusion at the bottom of the screen and in between the letters. So it's looking pretty good. If we look at our single pass rendering, this is what we're actually rendering out. So reflections will look something like this. With a brighter reflection setting than I just set in the file, it would be brighter, which would be good. Ambient occlusion is a bright white scene only showing the occlusion pass. So this is something you'd use on multiply mode. Reflections you might use on screen or add. Global illumination, in this case, when I rendered it out, I wasn't really happy with, so I didn't use it. I would need to refine my global illumination settings for that to be useful at all. Shadow, as I mentioned, there are no shadows because there are no lights in this image. And Object Buffer 2, you can see, is simply a mask. It's an alpha channel that is showing the object itself as solid, complete white, with black being everything else. So we can use this as a matte for our image in After Effects. So the next video will be setting up all of these files and creating your scene in After Effects.